Good morning. Well, you can take the teacher out of the classroom, but you can never take the classroom out of the teacher. So what an incredible room this is. I have spoken in a lot of rooms that don't have really windows. There are windows back there, but it doesn't feel that way. This is really one of the nicest rooms I've had the pleasure of speaking in, and I'm delighted to be with you here this morning. So let me take you on a bit of a quick guided tour of this group called Change the Equation. And your first question is, what is Change the Equation? You see on this list the current board of directors, so you at least begin to get a feel that we have something to do with the business community. And in fact, we are a group of about 100 companies, almost all of which you've heard of, that have joined together to increase their impact, to accomplish more than they might do on their own. And our effort is to mobilize the business community to really improve the participation and the performance of students pre-K-12 in STEM learning. Here's a list of our current members. I know it's hard to read, but the vast majority of those companies all have STEM expertise as their core competency. There's some old companies, Procter & Gamble, GE, IBM, and there's some real new kids on the block, not that Facebook and Google are so new anymore, but it really just shows the whole spectrum. But what I'm especially proud of are the companies that aren't so obviously STEM-based. Sony Pictures, Epic Games, which creates video games. And all of these companies recognize that their workforce is dependent on STEM literacy and STEM knowledge. Why did Change the Equation form? Well, we're in our terrible twos, having launched in September of 2010. And there were several motivations behind the formation of Change the Equation. But this encapsulates the primary notion. You've been hearing time and time again reporters saying that they cannot find the STEM talent that they need, whether they're looking for the video designer of Tiger Woods' game, which is really having pictures of golf courses that requires significant technology knowledge, or IBM, which certainly is looking for engineers and programmers. Now, there's a controversy about this whole issue. Are we producing enough STEM graduates, or are we not? It partly depends who you ask. Some researchers say that the number of people who are graduating with STEM degrees each year are sufficient to fill the jobs. And what they specify is that STEM wages are not rising so fast as to suggest that supply and demand is out of whack. That's one point of view. The other point of view says, well, we're not so sure about that. First of all, you find that many STEM majors, whether they're from science or engineering or math or computer science, are being drawn into other fields. You have no idea how much recruiting Wall Street does at schools of engineering, because those folks have learned a certain habit of mind, a certain way of thinking, and they are wonderful problem solvers that are being drawn out. But the other question is this balance, is this problem saying that we have a lack of qualified talent? Is that the reason for the argument? A geographic mismatch? A subspecialty mismatch? We don't have enough petroleum engineers. We have too many petroleum engineers. Just what is behind it? It is in that environment that we come back to Change the Equation. Our members are the CEOs of our companies, which is not to say that I have CEOs calling me every day. I wouldn't mind talking to some of them, but they're not necessarily calling every day. But technically, that's our membership. The first thing that we're doing as an organization is advocating for change, and we focus on the state level. We do not really deal with federal legislation. Companies have fairly large lobbying houses in D.C. that are all over the federal legislation because there are lots of workforce issues, and workforce and education competencies often go together. So we focus, frankly, on the state level. We are also working with our companies to help them be more strategic in their philanthropy. Together, our member companies alone, and that's not all of corporate America, invest 2/3 of $1 billion a year. Yet there is a strong recognition that it's not necessarily all going to the best resources. The change, the improvement, is not commensurate with that investment. And last but not least, this whole issue of inspiration. There are so many kids in the inner city, when you say to them, what's an engineer? Their answer is the guy who drives the subway. I mean, they don't have role models in their life, in their vision, and they don't have a real sense of it. And there's also not widespread knowledge of the breadth of careers that really require a background in STEM. You know, there are two terms, STEM capable and STEM dependent. STEM dependent are the obvious jobs that require a degree in STEM. STEM capable is almost everything else. Almost everything else. When I graduated high school, those boys who went right into the automotive shops at the local gas stations, those grease monkeys, were just using their hands and were making. But now they've got computers in those things we used to call cars. And the whole notion of how you go about fixing that electronic system is dramatically different. So it's in this recognition that we don't have the talent we need, and we therefore are challenging our level and our rate of innovation, very much what your senator said to you in her presentation. So one of the things that Change the Equation undertook was a study of STEM Help Wanted. And what you see here is the breakdown, particularly for Minnesota. What we looked at was the census population data from the Census Department, which is a monthly survey of those unemployed that's conducted by the Bureau for Labor Statistics. This data was collected between March 2009 and February 2012. I say that to remind you that this was really at the height of the recession. So it's timely data, but hopefully it's soon going to be past data. We also looked at what are the job postings that are out there. And we know that on online postings, the service industries, retail, and construction are underrepresented. If you have a new construction site and you're looking for welders, you're probably not going to put it on an online posting. On the other hand, computer jobs, math, science, engineering, healthcare, and business management, office administration are very well represented. And this is the picture in Minnesota. If you look at all of those unemployed in Minnesota, you have 2.7 people looking for one job. Part of the reason unemployment is not falling. But if you look at STEM qualified people, those unemployed, but those with STEM knowledge and credentials, you find that for every person, there are 2.4 job openings. So despite all the robust data that you have in Minnesota, you already have a shortfall, and as companies grow and expand, that shortfall, as you've heard this morning, will merely increase. So what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about some leverage points, some places that you might want to look at. You know, we have the M states when we talk about STEM learning. It's Massachusetts, it's Minnesota, and it's Maryland. And they're often held up as exemplars of good things that are happening. We don't say too much about Montana or Mississippi, but at least we have some of those M states that we use. So there's a significant amount to be proud of. But I still want to show you some leverage points that I think are food for thought, and particularly follow on the whole project that we heard from Marilee before about collecting data. So here's a picture across the country, but your eye, of course, is going to Minnesota, of the number of 4-year-olds who are participating in public pre-K. And as you can see, the darker colors are the higher percentages. Minnesota is falling between 1 and 10% of 4-year-olds in public pre-K. That's not to say that some parents aren't paying to put their children in pre-K, but for those families for whom resources are an issue, it's often public pre-K that matters. So Minnesota is not in the forefront on this particular lever. Here's a look at the percent of children in all-day kindergarten. If you look in Minnesota, you find not quite a third of the students are in full-day kindergarten, whereas the United States as whole, nearly 2/3 are in all-day kindergarten. Again, here's a little caveat. If parents are paying for full-day kindergarten care, Minnesota's increase goes up to 37%. But the bottom line remains that when you look at your math standards, when you look at Common Core and English Language Arts, when you look at Next Gen, if and when you adopt them, they are setting pretty ambitious goals in kindergarten that are, in a sense, predicated on a full day. So there's another lever point. I don't want to go through every grade and every year, so let me leap for a moment to 8th grade mathematics. And as you know, under No Child Left Behind, and even before No Child Left Behind, Minnesota was testing its students regularly to see what their progress is. It's your own state assessment. And every test passes a bar for proficiency. What's good enough? What's a good grade? And what's not a good grade? Here, Minnesota, this is when I say you're one of the M states, you're way near the top of the states that are listed here in terms of where they set proficiency. So the dot is the proficiency rate, and then you've got the statistical means around it. But what you can see is the place that states are setting their bar is mapped against the National Assessment of Educational Progress, where the U.S. government sets basic, below basic, and proficient. And in the case of Minnesota, even though you're well near the top, where you folks are setting proficient is not yet at NAEP's definition of proficient. And what does this mean? Well, I'm the parent, and I'm getting a letter, and it's saying, your kid is doing great. Well, in Minnesota, that's probably pretty true. It's not so true with a lot of states near the bottom, where they're getting the same letter. But maybe not as great as you really want them to be. So this gives you a sense of where you fall in the continuum. And let me stop now and look particularly at the NAEP results. NAEP sampling, as you know, is very statistically sound, and the Minnesota sample has 78% of the student population white, 8% black, 6% Hispanic, 6% Asian Pacific Islander, 2% Indian Alaska Native, and 1% 2 or more. I think that's a good reflection of the state's demographics as well. But what you can see is the administration of NAEP to a sample of 8th grade students in Minnesota in 2003 and 2011. The good news is the third column. All of them went up over that period of time. Not quite to the most improved states, but some of those, when you're going from the, parking garage 20 levels below to the parking garage 5 levels below, you may be getting a lot more traction. But you certainly have something that you can be fairly proud of until you start looking more particularly at the data. And you see, for example, that low income in 2011 was scoring 276. And to put this in perspective, 299 is where you have proficiency. When I worked in the Department of Ed, I never could have said this because it's not 100% legal and accurate in terms of NAEP scores, but I can say it to you now. Generally, 10 points on NAEP is about equivalent to 1 grade, 1 year in school. So if you've got your white students at 302 in 2011, you can do the subtraction between your other disaggregated groups, low income and students of color, and see that there are some ways in which you've got some leverage points to do something. It is certainly true that across the country, progress has not been uniform. These are the same 2 years, 2003 and 2011. And what I find when I present state data is people always want to say, well, how's everybody else doing? And that's the reason I've included some of these maps. So you can see again the darker colors are showing the greatest gains. Minnesota is respectable with a 4-point gain, but not quite as high as some of the others. And one of the fair questions you might ask yourself, if we focused on students of color and managed to raise their performance, would we in fact be seeing greater gains? Let me skip now to high school and take a look at calculus in particular. And here, what you see are the percentage of white students in high schools without calculus. Now, not that this is the best or greatest indicator, but it is an indicator, and that's the reason I'm including it. So about a quarter of white students nationwide are in high schools without calculus. Here, a third of your white students are in high schools. Similar data for Hispanics, 29% nationally, 34%, again, a little over a third. And finally, 35% of African American students nationally are in high schools without calculus, and here 34%. So about a third of your students are consistently in high schools that are not offering more rigorous courses. Let me turn my attention for a moment to science, and you see the exact similar graph that I showed you for math, except the states are slightly different. There are 30 states that are included in this analysis, and again you can see that Minnesota is one of the shining examples, along with Massachusetts. Here you have set proficient at the same place that NAEP has set proficient. So for whatever reason, and I don't know why, you have higher expectations in science than you do in mathematics. But let's unpack science just a little bit, and let's look at the amount of time spent on science in grades 1 through 4. What you hear all the time is that all of this testing that we've been undertaking of late, particularly focused on math and English language arts, is stealing time from science and stealing time from hands-on exploration. So Change the Equation wanted to see how accurate this was. In 1994, the national average was 2.9 hours per week. Minnesota comes in under that average, 2.5. But plug this map into your head, look at how dark the states are, and again, the dark colors are showing more time. Wow, 2008. Texas is still spending time. But look at how the map has changed dramatically. And in fact, why is it not coming on? It's not coming on, I don't know why. The national average is 2.3, there it is, 2.3 hours per week, and Minnesota is 1.9. So yeah, you're following the national trend. You are lessening the amount of time spent, but you are behind the national curve on this. And that's another fair question. You've got high expectations by 8th grade in your science, but perhaps you need to look at the time that's being spent in elementary school. What I'd like to look at here is the percent proficient between 4th grade and 8th grade in math and in science, but this is disaggregated by race. So what you see, with the exception of 8th grade science, the percent proficient was less in 8th grade than it was in 4th grade. This is not unusual. This is another national trend that you are following. Something is happening through that period of time in middle school. We're losing kids' attention, we're losing kids' interests. And what you can see in each case are the amount of Minnesota students who are proficient. So in 4th grade, the white students, 60% of them are proficient. In 8th grade, 55% of them are proficient. In science, the white students in 4th grade, only 51% are proficient. In 8th grade, 49%. So again, data to think about. About a month ago, maybe a month and a half ago, the U.S. Department of Education released a study, a transcript study, that looked specifically at the content of courses. And though this is not Minnesota specific, I think it's important enough to show you. We heard earlier about TIMSS, the Trends in International Study. I've been in this field so long that I remember SIMS, which was the second international math study, before we let science play with us. And what we found in SIMS, and that was given in 1986, what we found then is that, in effect, the U.S. 8th graders were really 4 grade levels apart. You could distinguish the math that our 8th grade students were taking. And by and large, the lowest group would end the year where the next higher group was beginning 8th grade. So you had 8th graders, in a sense, 4 years apart. Well, this is pretty devastating research that just came out. All these courses have the same name. They're called Algebra 1, and that's 9th grade and up, so not an 8th grade course, and they're called Geometry. The course levels are based on the textbooks. In other words, an analysis was done of the materials in there. And the rankings were based on the curriculum topics dependent on their level of challenge to students. So what you see, for example, is that there are really 3 Algebra 1s that are being given. The content of them is dramatically different. The white bar at the top shows the elementary and middle school mathematics that's being taught. So even in the rigorous course, 10% of the course is considered a review of elementary and middle school math. Introductory algebra is the next part, but just jump down, you can see that they've all got the same name, and on the transcript they all look alike, but they're dramatically different. And the same thing is true of geometry. This is not Minnesota specific, but perhaps it's of value to you in thinking about it. Here's another part of that same study, and it also is looking at the designation of those courses as either a 2-year algebra course, a regular algebra course, or a designated honors algebra course. So I'm very happy my kids are in honors algebra 2. But wait a minute, look at that algebra 1, honors algebra 1. 73% of that course is considered intermediate content. In fact, the regular algebra 1 classes have more rigorous content than the honors. You see the same thing in geometry. So it's truth in lending. The other issue to think about is, what is the teaching quality? I'm a firm believer that teachers are all well-intentioned. Nobody wakes up in the morning and brushes their teeth and thinks, I think I'll really mess up some kids for the rest of their life today. I don't believe that at all. But not all teachers have a toolkit to help them deal with all of the challenges that they would face. The problem is figuring out teacher quality remains a hard issue for us. And at the best data we have for the moment are proxies at best. And that's all this is. I wouldn't claim for more. How many teachers at least have a major in mathematics? Across the country, for those 8th graders who are mostly in suburban schools, in other words, they're not eligible for free and reduced lunch, about 1/3 of them have teachers without math majors, 45% in Minnesota. Here we have it in more high-poverty schools, inner city and often rural schools, and again, eligible for free and reduced lunch. Across the country, 28% actually have teachers with a major. In Minnesota, 42%. So these are leverage points that you might want to think about. And another similar look, one is, do you know the content? Another is, do you have experience? Do you have a toolkit that can tell you how to meet different student needs and how to do things? So this is a look at 8th graders with experienced teachers. What you see pretty consistently, for Minnesota in particular, is that your black students are getting teachers with less experience than other groups, low income and Hispanic. I know you have a small population, but nonetheless, this is pretty consistent, and you can see in comparison. So a fair question is, are black students being left behind? They seem to have the least access to teachers with the background, the least access to teachers who say they have the support that they need, which is what you can see on this graph. So it shows access to teachers with an undergraduate in math, teachers who have all or most of what they need to teach math, and teachers who have all or most of what they need to teach science. And you particularly see science. I've got the materials I need for hands-on. The other fact that I would put out there for you is that 47% of Minnesota's first-time community college students who just graduated from high school, so they go from graduation right to the 2-year program, need remediation in math. In other words, they're not ready for college-level math. That costs the state in the public institutions $33 million a year. Well, I'm getting real short on time because I know we want to do Q&A. So let me just mention that another thing that Change the Equation has done is create an online game, ionfuture.org, which is targeted for middle school students. I would urge you to take a look at this. It's free, available, fun to play with. Kids can match their interest with careers. And let me end there and turn it back to you, but I think I'm supposed to stay here.
Yeah, we have a few minutes for some questions.
Just remind you to repeat the question for our audience.
Yes, ma'am.
So you talked a lot about the qualities and the qualifications of our 8th grade teachers in math and science. I actually think the problem of the issue goes further back in our elementary schools. So what data has been collected in Minnesota on the number of math and science college-level courses our teachers are taking in these elementary schools before they actually go into the profession? And how many of those teachers who are in the profession in elementary schools actually pursue and engage in professional development in math and science? And if those numbers are small, how do we move to the state and set that bar higher so where teachers who are teaching in the elementary schools, I'm not talking about those that are coming out of the state case program, the state case has already set that bar, but how do we move the state to say the young age, second graders, first graders, need those qualified math and science teachers? It's not enough to just want to teach elementary and be free.
So let me encapsulate a very rich question and see if I get it right. Essentially, one of the real issues is the knowledge base and teaching skills of elementary school teachers in math and science. What does the landscape look like in Minnesota, and what can be done, assuming the landscape isn't what it ought to be, to improve it? Did I capture the essence? Okay, so on the first question is, what is the data on Minnesota? I'm going to have to plead ignorance. I don't have the most up-to-date data. Perhaps your project is collecting that. Pardon me, but I'm not going to be able to answer that part of the question. It is a common phenomenon, and I know you were not doing this, for each level to look at the previous level and point out that that's the source of the problem. And the fact is, and I know that's not what your message was at all, but yes, there are many points along the continuum that we have to address. It's true that in many states, elementary teachers have taken only one or maybe two undergraduate courses that prepare them to teach math and science. Some of the states are moving to math and science specialists in an effort to try to ameliorate that problem. Again, I'm going to have to defer to folks from the State Department of Education about what can be done. But I would say that Change the Equation member companies, and if you come to my session in the afternoon, I'll talk a little bit about it, are investing in philanthropic programs that provide professional development to teachers, and with a particular focus on K-8, on the K-8 sequence.
Let me connect a couple things. Dean Weinkauf talked about having an artist who becomes an engineer, and the next generation science standards talk about, at least the framework document talks about science and engineering as creative disciplines. So I'm curious about how we change the way your member companies and maybe the way policymakers see science and engineering, because we tend to measure what's easy to measure as opposed to the things that are hard to measure, like creativity and hands-on activities and things like that. So how do we get your member companies to see what happens in education differently and how we measure it so that they can also affect our policy?
Sure. So the question is, there's more to STEM competency than just the content and the discipline, but there is habits of mind, problem solving, creativity. How do we measure those, and how do we begin to value those? So, not to pick a fight, but I'd push back to say that companies don't already value those things. When they are hiring, they are looking for employees who think out of the box, who are most comfortable out of the box, and who are challenging conventional thinking. So they certainly value and recognize all of those qualities. I would hope that next generation science standards, which Minnesota is looking at, provides a vehicle to begin to incorporate a different way of thinking about science. It's the first time we've seen standards out there with engineering embedded, and I'm sure Steve talked about that when he met with you several months back. That's really groundbreaking. And the notion of trying to define a different level of success, what does success look like, is really an issue that's out there for all of us. But it's not just the business community that has to figure it out. It's really the business community and the education community has to agree upon indicators of what that looks like. And frankly, no one has been able to do that, to my knowledge, yet. It doesn't mean that it's not a worthy goal. I just don't think we've been able to tackle it. One of the challenges in our member companies is their very generous philanthropic efforts and the need to be able to explain to their board of directors, because it's usually coming through a foundation, that that money is yielding a return on investment. Because they're answering, I mean, it's the corporate way of thinking, how do you know that you are getting a return on the investment? So our companies, I would say in the sine curve of life, our companies are all sort of converging on this notion of proven effective practices. Proven effective practices. We will invest in something that we know for sure is going to yield results. There's not a lot out there that really gets at the picture of the kind of creativity and collaboration that you're talking about that also has proven results. So I'm hopeful in the sine curve that we'll move towards that. I think there was another question. Yes, sir.
So with the next generation science fairs coming out, you have implementation, and you have the Common Core, and you're going to have, I guess, what is your sort of, how do the states like Texas and these who are increasing the science time in the classroom and things like that, at the cost or at sort of the balance of reading and other things, the other things that your child has time is driving? Sort of how is that, what's your opinion on how that's sort of going to shake out in the next 5 years as the United States, implement next generation science standards, kind of balance off the time, because it's trying to make such strides in reading and mathematics, which the science, how is that all going to work out when you really only have, the time isn't going to change unless the third generation will do it. So I guess, what do you sort of foresee in that space?
So the question, let me see if I've captured your question as well, is how are we going to make enough time in the day to still include reaching mastery in mathematics and English language arts as well as science and all of the other creative, collaborative thinking that we want to have happen. Just yesterday, moments before I came to the airport, across my screen was a new report called Learning Time in America, Trends to Reform the American School Calendar. Real quick, I went to Minnesota, and I just want to read you some numbers. In Minnesota, kindergartners spend about 425 hours a year in school. In grade 6, they spend 935 hours a year, and in grades 7 through 12, 1,020 hours. Okay. Well, how do I think about that? Let me just contrast you. In Louisiana, all grades, K through 12, spend 1,062 hours a year. In Maryland, all kids, grades K-12, spend 1,080 hours a year. In Michigan, there's another M, all kids, K-12, spend 1,098 hours a year in school. So I wouldn't accept the premise that the school day or the school year are fixed. Clearly, there are other states in the Union who are seeing it necessary to lengthen the amount of time. And I think that's a fairly clear movement that's coming up, which doesn't mean more of the same boring drill to kill. What it could mean is a longer school day and a longer school year that enables the kind of creative exploration of science and math and engineering and all the 21st century skills that fit into that day. So I think that the pendulum is swinging a little bit on the time issue. We're still on that agrarian calendar where kids had to get out of school early enough to go help mom and dad plant seeds. It's still true for some kids, but it's certainly not true for everyone. And my first answer is I think things are changing. I also think that we need to step up our game in the way that we are combining disciplines in teaching certain ideas. So my own background is mathematics. I happen to think we're the queen of the sciences rather than the handmaiden of the sciences. You know, there are two famous quotes. I like the first one, not the second one. Certainly mathematics is the language of STEM, and we now can see in Next Gen the relationship between science and engineering. There's all this pushback on Common Core English language arts about, oh, we're not going to read the classics anymore, and people are saying, what Common Core are you reading? That's not true. But clearly, we have to be much smarter in making use of the time that we have, even while we recognize we may have to extend it. The one other point that I would make is there are a significant number of after-school programs, after-school, out-of-school programs that are becoming very, very active in STEM. You've heard of all of them. It's Scouting, 4-H, Boys and Girls Clubs, the whole usual list of the biggies. They've all got a significant STEM curriculum. And they don't have the accountability yoke of having to get kids to take a test at the end. And schools partnering with these programs really can find a way to deepen and expand the learning opportunity that kids have. Thank you very much.
Just a few housekeeping items. First of all, if you're tweeting this morning, please use the hashtag MNSTEMNetwork. And I also wanted to let you know that for our breakout sessions, the format that we're using is it's called the Pachucacha format, and it's 20 slides. Each presenter has 20 slides, 20 seconds per slide. So it keeps things moving along very quickly, very concisely, get to the point. And so that's a minute, 1 minute per slide. Okay, still, talk fast. And okay, a minute per slide. We got 3 of these sessions here in Round Horse, and we have room 370 session is down the hall and on this floor, and then the library is 2 floors down opposite the dining hall, and there should be a guide down there, or probably several people, to point you in the right direction. And we'll see you back here at 11:30. Please grab something to eat, a cup of coffee, and we'll see you shortly. Thanks.